Next, we're going to talk about cartilaginous joints. So remember, cartilaginous is a way we classify joints based on structure. Structural classifications, there are three. You have fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. We just got done talking about fibrous, and now we're going to talk about cartilaginous. So the tissue that makes up cartilaginous joints will be cartilage, either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. Okay? So cartilaginous joints also lack a joint cavity, just like we saw in fibrous joints. The fact that there's no joint cavity means that very little, if any, motion will be allowed. So cartilaginous joints will either be synchondroses, meaning immovable, no movement, or amphiarthroses, which will allow, amphiarthrotic joints allow slight movement or just a little bit of movement. Okay? And then the two types of specific types of cartilaginous joints that we're going to learn, they're called syncondroses and symphysis joints. All right, so the first specific type of cartilaginous joint is called a syncondrosis. Syncondroses for plural, synchondrosis for singular. Syncondrosis joints are bones that are linked together by hyaline cartilage, and they are immovable. So we classify them based on function as synarthrotic joints. So they are immovable. Two locations where you find synchondrosis joints will be the epiphyseal plates and then the sternocostal and sternocondral joints. I'll talk about that in just a second. So the first example of a synchondrosis joint, or the first specific location of a synchondrosis joint rather, is the epiphyseal plate. This is composed of hyaline cartilage, and down here we can see this is a long bone. And remember, this is why you can't just forget things from previous chapters. It all builds on each other. So this is just a basic long bone. All long bones have these expanded ends called epiphyses with a slender shaft called a diaphysis. In between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, we have this band of hyaline cartilage, which remains, remember, after our endochondral ossification. Remember, the only hyaline cartilage that remains after endochondral ossification will be the epiphyseal plate and then the articular cartilage right here around the epiphysis. But this epiphyseal plate is a band of hyaline cartilage that allows for the lengthening of long bones. Think of it, it's much easier to build hyaline cartilage, which is a little more pliable, a little more flexible, than it is to try to quickly build bone. So the epiphyseal plates are functional junctions they're within the same long bone, but it's between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So this is considered a synchondrosis joint. Now, we don't want our epiphysis and our diaphysis to be movable, slight movement, nor freely movable. So that's why this joint is a synarthrotic joint. So it's immovable. Now, the epiphyseal plate is the most delicate structure of a long bone while it exists. Over time, this epiphyseal plate will ossify. We know that because at a certain age, we stop growing taller, correct? So we stop growing taller because over time, this epiphyseal plate will ossify. When it ossifies, so when we stop growing and we are no longer lengthening our long bones, that epiphyseal plate gets replaced with bone, and it's no longer called a synchondrosis, but rather a synostosis. So this is the term we use for the epiphyseal line, which is the remnants of what once was an epiphyseal plate, right? So again, when it's still hyaline cartilage and we have the ability to grow in length, this is called a synchondrosis joint. It's classified as a synarthrotic joint based on function because it's immovable. It's classified as a cartilaginous joint based on structure because it's composed of hyaline cartilage. As we age and get into adulthood and we stop growing in length, this epiphyseal plate becomes the epiphyseal line. It's replaced by bone, and we no longer call it a synchondrosis because it doesn't have cartilage there. We call it a synostosis when it's replaced with bone. All right? So in children, this is a joint called a synchondrosis. In adults, it's no longer a joint, rather it's ossified bone called a synostosis. All right? Okay, so that's the first specific location of a synchondrosis joint. The next location of a synchondrosis joint is between rib 1 and the manubrium of the sternum. Both this right here and here, so this would be called the sternocostal, sternocostal, and costochondral. So sternocostal means between the sternum and the costal cartilage, right here. Here's the costal cartilage. Costochondral would be between the costal cartilage, costo, and the ribs. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, so here, this is between rib 1 and the manubrium of the sternum. This is a location of a synchondrosis joint. It is also classified as synarthrotic and it's immovable. So between rib 1 and the sternum, this is an immovable joint. And the reason for that is because we need at least one of the ribs to anchor kind of the entire thoracic cage together, to kind of anchor it all in place. So this rib between rib 1 and the manubrium is the most stable of all of the rib to sternum joints, and it's to anchor the thoracic cage in place, right? Now, what it's highlighting here are these are the costochondral joints between the rib and the costal cartilage. Now, we'll learn later on when we talk about synovial joints, the remaining ribs, I've always learned it, is that the remaining ribs to sternum, these are plain synovial joints, and it allows for a sliding type movement so that the thoracic cage can expand when you take a really deep inhalation. So what I want you to know is that between rib 1 and the manubrium of the sternum, that is a synchondrosis joint. That is a specific type of joint called a synchondrosis. It's classified as a synarthrotic joint based on function. It is immovable. The main function of this joint between rib 1 and the manubrium is to anchor the rest of the thoracic cage in place. And we classify this rib 1 and manubrium, this first joint right here, we classify it as a cartilaginous joint based on structure. So that's what I want you to know. So if I were to ask on the test, give me a specific example of a synchondrosis joint, you could tell me you could explain the epiphyseal plate between the epiphysis and diaphysis of a long bone. You could also tell me between rib 1 and the manubrium of the sternum. These two locations, these specific locations, are examples of where you find synchondrosis joints. All right? If I give you either this or this location, and I ask you to tell me the specific type of joint located here, you would tell me synchondrosis. If I ask you to classify this joint or this joint based on function, you would tell me it's a synarthrotic joint or a synarthrosis, meaning immovable, does not allow movement. If I give you these two locations and I ask you to classify that joint based on structure, you would tell me cartilaginous. All right? And then the second specific type of cartilaginous joint is a symphysis joint. Symphysis for singular, symphyses for plural. Symphysis joints are composed of fibrocartilage. All right, so these bones are united or joined by fibrocartilage pad. All right. Locations where you can find symphysis joints. The first one being the intervertebral discs. So if you remember back to previous chapters, like chapter 4 when we learned about tissues and we talked about fibrocartilage, or in chapter 7 when you read about intervertebral discs, these are fibrocartilage pads that link or bind the bodies of the vertebrae together. right? So here are the bodies of the vertebrae. In between the bodies, we have these fibrocartilage pads. Where do we find fibrocartilage? Where we need to be able to resist compression, have good shock absorption, but also we want slight movement within movement within our spine. And so we want our spinal column to be stable because it's protecting, it has to help maintain weight of the upper body. It also has to house and protect the spinal cord. So we want stability, but we also want flexibility of the spine itself, okay? So these joints, symphysis joints, are amphiarthrotic joints, meaning they allow slight movement, all right? So intervertebral discs, that's the first location where you find a symphysis joint made up of fibrocartilage, resists compression. It also is a very good shock absorber. And then the second location where you find symphysis joints is the pubic symphysis. It's a fibrocartilage pad that connects the two pubic bones of the os coxae, of the pelvic girdle, together. So this would be the pubic region of the os coxae, and they're bound together by this pubic symphysis, which is a fibrocartilage pad. Also amphiarthrotic, meaning it allows slight movement. Why slight movement? Well, if you're talking about just a man, or if you were a non-pregnant female, it would be pretty sturdy. It very, very slight movement, okay, but pretty sturdy. Now, when a female gets pregnant and is closer to the end of the pregnancy, and there are certain hormonal cues, that pubic symphysis can become more movable. And the reason for that is so that we can have the pelvic cavity expand, and it allows for an easier birth, for the fetus to be released from the pelvic cavity, okay? So there can be a little bit more movement upon the appropriate hormonal cues later on in pregnancy in a female, okay? All right, so if I were to give you intervertebral discs or a pubic symphysis, and I ask you to classify, what is this specific type of joint called, you would say a symphysis joint. If I ask you to classify this joint or this joint based on function, you would tell me it's an amphiarthrosis joint, okay? Because it's slightly movable. If I were to give you this location or this location and ask you to classify this joint based on the structure, you would tell me cartilaginous. So you should be able to give me specific locations of each of these joints. If I give you a joint, you should be able to tell me the specific name. You should be able to classify it based on function. You should be able to classify it based on structure, okay? This is anatomy and physiology in the real world, so it's a clinical application. It's talking about epiphyseal plate fractures. Again, that epiphyseal plate, which is an example of a syncondrosis joint. It's a cartilaginous joint based on structure, and it is a synarthrotic joint classified based on function. It is, though, the most fragile or the weakest part of the developing skeleton, especially in long bones, and so it's prone to fractures, especially if you have, if you're a young child who is in competitive athletics or just into recreational activities, clumsy, anything like that, okay? So you can read through this if you would like to understand a little bit more about epiphyseal plate fractures, but I won't ask that on the test unless I'm giving you a situation where you have to apply what you already need to know to a clinical application. So reading through these things will help you study and apply what you've just learned in the chapter to a clinical setting, okay?